The World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, is where global leaders, investors, and decision makers meet to talk about money, jobs, growth, and the future of their country. This year, I think it was a particularly important meeting to attend by world leaders with so much geopolitical uncertainty and really not being very clear about what happens next on the world stage. So the real question is, what was our elevator pitch? Because leaders from around the world had a few minutes to really talk about their countries and make the case for investment and global, or at least security. We've invited our chief diplomat, the International Relations and Cooperation Minister, Ronald Lamola, who joins us now on the line. Minister, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Listeners of Radio 702.
Minister, you had the extraordinary job because, as I understand it, the president wasn't there, so you essentially were one of the most senior representatives of our country in the room. What was your elevator pitch for South Africa at Davos?
Thank you very much, Bongani. Indeed, we were led by the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana. We had a story about South Africa, as you are aware, that we have turned a corner on the energy security with regards to load shedding, now having electricity and energy to be able to bring in investment, and also on the logistics sector, Transnet having done well to clear the backlog in the various ports in our country, but also us having just came off the back of the removal from the grey listing from FATF, the European Union, and other negative platforms. So South Africa had a positive story to tell. And also, as you are aware, we had just hosted the G20, where global leaders converged in Johannesburg in South Africa to discuss various issues of global significance, including the affirmation of the UN Charter, the reform of the international financial architecture, issues related to climate change, artificial intelligence. So South Africa had a very good story to tell with regards to how the G20 went, and also its leaders' declaration anchored on the UN Charter. And you have also been very aware of the work we've done with the African Union on the Africa Free Trade Area, the big market that Africa is creating, and also the developmental platform of BRICS. So South Africa had a number of platforms that shows that the country is on a good trajectory.
Minister, one would argue that all those developments, whilst welcome, being removed off the grey list, our energy progress, and even perhaps on transport and logistics, all of those welcome developments, but they were in a sense own goals to begin with. Nonetheless, there was the who's who of global leaders, business leaders, and our president was absent. Would you not say that that perhaps was a misstep? But more importantly, when it comes to how the international system is working, have we misread the room?
It was not a misstep at all. The absence of the president, not all countries were represented at a presidential level. And as you are aware, some of them even in the previous year were not represented at the presidential level. Our president had attended last year and also put the pitch on our G20 presidency. He gave the message. This year, unfortunately, he could not be able to attend. So there was a message of South Africa that we delivered. And as you have already asked whether we have not misread the room, the message that came across from all leaders in Davos, in particular Canada, the European Union, and some of the leaders of the BRICS countries, was affirming what South Africa had always affirmed: the resolution of global conflict and peaceful dialogue through that is being anchored on the UN Charter, respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries when discussing issues of the global financial architecture, it has also been the message that South Africa has always anchored on these issues, as I have already said, with regards to the declaration, if you remember, at the G20, and also our president's address to the UN General Assembly. We have always advocated for resolution of global conflict through peaceful means and dialogue, and that has always been anchored on the UN Charter, and that as the world evolves, the UN Charter should be the guiding tool for all member states of the United Nations and across the globe. And obviously, South Africa has always had various platforms to mitigate developmental issues and to advance such developmental issues, which includes the African Union, the Africa Free Trade Area, that South Africa has always championed, including the BRICS platform.
Minister, I'll tell you why I'm raising the issue of the president's attendance. I mean, it was great that he was there last year, but one could argue that there's a lot more uncertainty about what happens in the world next at this hour, and that perhaps this one was the one not to miss. And I wonder if you were in the room when the Canadian Prime Minister made these comments. Just have a listen.
For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works.
We've premised our entire approach on believing that the rules-based international order is what it claims to be, and yet consistently we have seen that it is something that's applicable only to some, as Mark Carney says there in that clip. And one of the points he made was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Minister, there are many South Africans who look at our foreign policy and say, he's right, we're on the menu.
Yeah, maybe, Bongani, you should also play the clip of the president at the UN General Assembly, which he outlined exactly similar issues that Mark Carney outlined. The reform of the UN Security Council, the reform of the UN institutions themselves. In the G20 declaration, if you also play that clip when he closed the G20 and when he opened, our president spoke about the reform of the global financial architecture, because it is no longer saving.
Why is it then that when Mark Carney says it, people listen, and when our president says it, they don't?
Maybe it's because we're Africans. That message has been said by many African heads of states and also by our president. You can play the clip from the UN General Assembly. You can listen to all the G20 messages. He has been saying exactly the same thing that Mark Carney said. There is no difference at all, except obviously the use of language and semantics. But the message was the same, that we need to reform all the global financial architecture, the UN Security Council, the platform of international engagements and resolutions of conflicts of the UN. In fact, he went further and said, when the UN was formed, almost 70% of the African countries were still under colonialism. Hence, now it needs reform to reflect the current realities of the African continent and that of the global South, not only of the African continent, and even countries in the BRICS platform, like Brazil, like India, and so forth. So this has been issues that we have been raising, and hence we have also formed alliances with some of these countries to build for the reform of the UN and to build for the reform of the global financial architecture, which became a clear outcome of the Johannesburg Declaration.
Minister Ronald Lamola, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for talking to us on 702 Breakfast this morning.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.